The men who held back the Mississippi River were fed worse than the mules standing next to them. The mules got measured oats. The men got whatever a camp cook could stretch out of cornmeal, salt pork, and boiling water. Levee camps ran along the Mississippi Delta from the 1870s through the 1940s, housing thousands of black workers who moved earth by hand. Number 19 came from a fish with armor-plated scales that most people threw back in the river. The brew they called beer at number 17 never touched a grain of barley. And number 7 took an entire day of cleaning before anyone would touch it. The modern food industry had no interest in remembering what a Levee camp cook created from almost nothing. Hit subscribe because this history disappears when no one tells it. Here are 25 Levee camp foods black workers ate that no one makes anymore. Number 25, ash cakes, a handful of cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to hold it together. The cook shaped the dough into flat rounds, wrapped each one in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, and buried them directly in the hot ashes of the cook fire. There was no pan, no skillet, no oven. The leaves kept the ash from sticking to the surface while the heat baked the cake from every direction at once. After 20 minutes or so, the cook raked them out, peeled off the charred wrapper, and handed them down the line. The outside had a faint smokiness from the fire and a papery crispness where the leaf had pulled away. The inside was dense, plain, and filling in a way that required no thought or appreciation, just chewing. Ash cakes were older than any other bread on the levee. The method came from West Africa through the Caribbean and had been used on plantations long before the levee system existed. By the time commercial bakeries reached the small towns along the river, nobody with access to an oven would choose to bury their bread in a fire. The ash cake did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because anything cooked directly in cinders looks primitive next to a loaf on a shelf. Number 24, fatback dipped in sorghum, a thick slab of pork fat cut from along the spine, fried in its own grease until the edges curled and went golden, then dragged through a pool of dark sorghum syrup on a tin plate. Nothing else followed. The fat and the sorghum together were all a man got. The fat delivered the calories a man needed to swing a shovel for 12 hours straight, and the sorghum gave him the only sweetness the camp offered. Cane sugar cost money. Sorghum was pressed from stalks grown on the same bottomland the levee was meant to protect. A worker could eat this with one hand, wipe the plate with a piece of bread, and be back on the line in minutes. The combination sounds extreme now. In a levee camp, it was survival arithmetic. Number 23, Mudcat stew. Mudcat was the local name for channel catfish pulled straight from the river the workers were trying to contain. The cook did not fillet them. The heads, the frames, the fins, the tails, everything went into the pot with water, salt, onion if there was one, and a handful of cornmeal to thicken it. The bones softened in the boil. The fat from the head melted into the broth and gave it a richness that no commercial fish stock has ever matched. A levee camp sat right next to the river, so catfish were free and constant. A man with a line and 30 minutes between shifts could pull in enough for the cook to stretch across 100 bowls. The stew was ugly, brown, and thick and full of things that had to be eaten around, but it was the one hot meal that cost the contractor nothing, which meant the cook could make it without asking permission. Number 22, crawfish from the borrow pits. The ditches dug alongside the levee filled with standing water, and crawfish moved in overnight. Workers scooped them out with their hands or with buckets after their shift ended. The cook dropped them alive into boiling water with salt and whatever wild onion grew nearby. There was no seasoning packet, no butter. The crawfish were small, muddy, and took work to eat for almost no meat. But a pile of them on a tin plate gave a man something to do with his hands in the evening, and the broth left in the pot carried enough flavor to stretch the next morning's breakfast. These were not the fat, farm-raised crawfish sold in Louisiana today. They were ditch creatures, caught for free, eaten because they were there. Number 21, Kush. The cook took yesterday's leftover cornbread, crumbled it into rough chunks, and dropped it into a skillet where salt pork fat was already shimmering. The crumbles fried until the edges turned dark and crunchy, and then the cook poured in a splash of Potlikker or water and let the whole mess steam together into something halfway between a hash and a stuffing. Some versions added chopped onion. Others added a spoonful of sorghum at the end for sweetness. Kush was a way of turning stale bread into a second meal without wasting a single crumb, and in a camp where the cook made cornbread every morning, there was always stale cornbread by evening. The dish had different names depending on who was cooking. Some called it kush kush, others called it fried cornbread mush. The principle was the same everywhere. Fat, heat, and yesterday's leftovers combined into something that tasted better than the original. When fresh bread became available at every meal, the logic behind Kush collapsed. Nobody crumbles bread on purpose when there is more bread coming. No history book spends much time on what comes next. The levee system that protects the modern Mississippi Delta was not built by engineers alone. It was built by labor camps. Contractors bid for sections of the levee, then recruited black men to do the digging. The work was shovels and wheelbarrows, sunup to sundown, in heat that cracked the ground. The camps were temporary. They moved with the work. A cook shack, a row of tents or rough-built cabins, a fire pit, and a supply wagon that showed up when the contractor felt like sending one. The food was whatever the cook could manage with what arrived, what grew nearby, and what the workers caught or shot after their shift. That limitation is where the invention lived. Every food on this list came out of a kitchen that officially did not exist, made by cooks whose names were never recorded. Number 20, snapping turtle. The rivers and borrow pits near the levee held plenty of them, some big enough that a single turtle fed the whole crew. Catching one was dangerous. A snapping turtle could take off a finger, and the shell had to be pried open with a heavy knife. The cook butchered the animal into pieces, dropped everything into the pot with water and salt, and simmered it for hours. The meat was dark and surprisingly tender once the connective tissue broke down. Each turtle carried several distinct textures depending on the part. Workers who grew up hunting in the Delta knew which pieces were choice and picked the pot accordingly. The cook who handled a snapping turtle without getting bitten earned a particular kind of respect in camp. The dish disappeared when the camps did, because nobody with a grocery store nearby is going to wrestle a 30-pound turtle out of a ditch. Number 19, alligator gar cakes. The alligator gar is a living fossil, a long armored fish with a jaw full of teeth and a body covered in diamond-shaped scales so hard they were once used as arrowheads by indigenous people along the river. Most fishermen who pulled one out of the Mississippi wanted nothing to do with it. The fish looked prehistoric, and the thick scales resisted a normal fillet knife completely. But levee camp workers knew how to handle one. The trick was getting past the armor. A man used a hatchet or a heavy blade to crack through the scales along the belly, then cut the thick white flesh away from the spine in slabs. The meat was firm, mild, and surprisingly clean tasting for a bottom-dwelling river fish that could weigh well over 100 pounds. The cook chopped the flesh fine, mixed it with cornmeal, a little onion if available, and salt, then formed the mixture into flat patties that went into hot grease in the camp skillet. The cakes fried up golden and held together because the gar meat had a natural stickiness from its dense protein. They tasted closer to crab cakes than anything a person would expect from a river. An adult alligator gar could reach 6 or 7 feet, which meant one fish produced enough patties to feed an entire crew. Nothing else in the river offered that kind of yield from a single catch. The bones were thick and the head was massive, and the cook dropped those into the stockpot for broth that carried a richness distinct from catfish or any other freshwater species. Alligator gar still swim in the Mississippi today. Conservation efforts protect them in some states now. The practice of catching them for camp food ended when the camps emptied, and the knowledge of how to break through those armored scales and turn that prehistoric fish into something men asked for by name went with the last cooks who learned it at the riverside. Number 18, smoked buffalo fish. Buffalo fish were heavy, bony, bottom feeders that filled the oxbow lakes and backwaters along the Mississippi. Most people threw them back. A levee camp cook kept everyone. The fish was scaled, split open, and hung on green willow racks over a slow fire of pecan or hickory until the smoke worked through the flesh and the edges turned copper-colored and stiff. Smoking did 2 things. It preserved the meat for days without ice, and it softened the web of fine bones enough that a man could chew through them without choking. The flavor was heavy, oily, and deep, nothing like the mild white fish a modern kitchen would recognize. A smoked buffalo fish laid across a piece of cornbread was a full meal that required no plate and no reheating. The fish was so abundant in the Delta that the supply never ran short, even in a camp of 200 men. When refrigeration reached the back roads and commercial catfish farming took over the market, nobody had a reason to smoke a buffalo fish again. Number 17, possum cooked over a pit. A possum trapped near the camp was singed over the fire to burn off the hair, gutted and slow roasted in a covered pit or Dutch oven with sweet potatoes packed around it. The fat rendered down into the potatoes during the long cook, and by the time the meat pulled from the bone, the sweet potatoes had absorbed enough drippings to taste like they had been candied. Possum was not a first-choice meat. It was what a man brought back when the fishing was poor and the squirrels were scarce. The animal was slow, easy to catch, and available year-round. The flavor divided people. Some found it greasy and strong. Others considered it the richest wild meat in the Delta. What made it valuable in a levee camp was the sheer amount of fat on one animal. A single possum could grease a cook's skillet for days after the meat was gone. Number 16, persimmon bread. Wild persimmon trees grew thick along the edges of the bottomland timber, and in late autumn, the fruit dropped soft and orange and sweet enough to eat out of hand. A cook who knew the tree understood that an unripe persimmon would pucker a man's mouth shut, but a ripe one, the kind that had gone so soft it nearly fell apart in the fingers, was pure sugar. The cook mashed the ripe fruit, picked out the seeds, and stirred the pulp into a batter of cornmeal, a little sorghum, and water. Baked in a skillet or a Dutch oven near the coals, it came out dense, dark, and sweeter than anything else in camp. Persimmon bread was seasonal, limited to the weeks in October and November when the fruit was ready, and that scarcity made it an event. Men talked about it the way they talked about a holiday. When the timber was cleared for farmland and the wild trees came down, the persimmons went with them. Number 15, squirrel and dumplings. The hardwood forests near the Delta bottomland were full of fox squirrels and gray squirrels, and camp workers who could shoot straight or set a snare brought them back by the handful. The cook skinned them, jointed them like small chickens, and simmered the pieces in water until the tough meat softened and the broth turned dark. Then came the dumplings. Cornmeal mixed with water and dropped in spoonfuls into the boiling broth where they steamed and swelled and soaked up the flavor of the simmered game. The squirrel meat was lean and tight-grained, nothing like chicken, with a faintly nutty taste that came from what the animal had been eating. A pot of squirrel and dumplings fed more men than the squirrels alone could have, because the dumplings did the stretching. When the forest shrank and the camps closed, the dish lost both its ingredient and its audience. This is where the story turns uncomfortable. The levee system that protects some of the most valuable farmland in America was built on the backs of black laborers whose wages were often docked for the food they were given, food they had no choice in and no say over. The cook was the only person in camp who turned that arrangement into something bearable. A good camp cook stretched the contractor's rations with foraged greens, hunted game and river fish, then built meals that kept men alive and sometimes willing to come back the next morning. These cooks were not trained in any formal sense. They were chosen because they were older, or because they had been injured on the line, or because someone remembered they could make something worth eating. They never called themselves chefs. They never recorded a single recipe, and the food they created has been almost completely left out of the story of American cooking. What happens next has nothing to do with the cook shack. Number 14, rabbit roasted on a green stick, a freshly cut branch, still green and full of sap so it would not catch fire, sharpened at one end, pushed through a clean cottontail rabbit, and propped over hot coals between two forked sticks driven into the ground. That was the full setup. But levee camp workers understood something about green wood that modern outdoor cooking took decades to catch up with. The sap inside the branch steamed as it heated, and that moisture basted the meat from the outside while keeping the wood from charring through. Hickory was preferred. Sweet gum worked. The faint smoke from each gave the meat a woody sweetness that no kitchen oven has ever reproduced. Rabbit was everywhere in the Mississippi Delta bottomland, fast, common, and easy to snare with a loop of wire set along a run. A man with 30 free minutes between his shift and dark could catch one close enough to camp to carry back before the fire burned down. The cook sometimes took them and stewed the pieces in the communal pot, but the green stick version was different. It was the one workers made themselves after hours with their own fire and their own catch. That distinction mattered. In a levee camp, almost everything belonged to the contractor. The labor, the schedule, the rations, the sleeping arrangement. But a rabbit caught on a man's own time, cleaned with his own knife, and roasted over a fire he built himself was something the contractor had no claim on. Cottontail rabbits still run through the Delta today by the thousands. The practice of roasting one whole on a green branch over open coals has not survived the century. Number 13, pawpaw fruit. Pawpaw trees grew in the shaded bottomland along the rivers, and when the fruit ripened in early fall, it dropped to the ground in soft, heavy pods that split open if you looked at them wrong. A worker who found a ripe one picked it up, tore it apart, and scooped out the custard-colored flesh with his fingers, spitting the large seeds into the dirt. The taste sat somewhere between banana and mango, sweet and tropical in a way that had no business growing in Mississippi. There was no cooking involved. The pawpaw was the only dessert most levee workers ever saw that did not come out of a pot. But the fruit bruised within hours and rotted within a day or two, so it could never be stored, shipped, or sold at any real distance. A man either found one on the ground during the narrow window when they fell, or he went without. That is why most people alive today have never tasted a fruit that grows wild in nearly every state east of the river. The trees are still out there. What vanished was the habit of walking the bottomland and knowing where to look. Number 12, frog legs from the borrow pits. The same flooded ditches that held crawfish also held bullfrogs. After dark, the frogs started calling, and a man with quick hands and a lantern could catch a dozen in half an hour. The cook cut the hind legs free, peeled the skin off in one pull, dredged them in cornmeal, and fried them. The legs twitched in the pan. Freshly cut frog legs contract when they hit hot grease, and a first-time cook learned not to flinch. The meat was white, tender, and mild, somewhere between fish and chicken. A plate of fried frog legs was a reward, not a ration, because catching them took effort nobody was required to spend. Workers who brought frogs back to the cook shack earned something wages could not buy in a levee camp: the respect that came from feeding others on your own time. The practice ended when the camps emptied, and the men who hunted those ditches after dark scattered across the country. Time equals 1 second / greater than number 11. Souse. When a hog was slaughtered near camp, the head went straight to the cook. The whole skull went into a pot of water and simmered for hours until every scrap of meat loosened from the bone and the collagen melted into a thick, sticky broth. The cook fished out the skull, pulled it apart by hand, discarded the teeth and the heaviest gristle, and chopped what remained into small pieces. All of that went back into the liquid and was poured into a mold or a tin can. As it cooled overnight, the natural gelatin solidified and locked everything into a firm loaf that could be sliced clean. Souse was eaten cold, laid across a slab of cornbread, or chewed plain in thick slices. The flavor was deep and porky, richer than any single cut because the head contained cheek, jowl, tongue, and connective tissue all concentrated together. Making it required hours of simmering and a willingness to handle a boiled animal skull, and both of those things became harder to justify once sliced bologna appeared in every country store for a few pennies. Number 10, pickled pig feet. The feet came off the hog at slaughter and went straight into a brine of vinegar, salt, hot peppers, and whatever spices the cook could get hold of. They sat in that brine for days, sometimes a week, until the vinegar worked its way through the skin and into the cartilage. The result was tangy, slippery, and required patience to eat because a pig foot is mostly bone, tendon, and gristle wrapped in a thin layer of gelatinous meat. A man sat on an overturned bucket and gnawed one down to bare bone, sucking the vinegar out of every joint. The appeal was partly flavor and partly the fact that pickled feet kept for weeks without any refrigeration at all, which made them one of the few proteins in camp that did not have to be eaten the same day it was cooked. Jars of pickled pig feet still show up in gas stations and corner stores across the South, but the practice of making them from scratch in a camp kitchen, starting from a whole hog killed that morning, belongs to a time when every part of the animal had a destination before the animal was even dead. Number 9, wild muscadine preserves. Muscadine grapes grew on heavy vines draped through the trees along the edges of the delta, and by late summer the fruit hung in loose clusters of dark purple globes with skins tough enough to pop between the teeth. A camp cook who had sorghum or a little sugar could boil the crushed fruit down into a rough preserve thick enough to hold its shape on a knife. The muscadine has a flavor that sits apart from any grocery store grape. It is musky, almost perfumed, and sweet in a way that hits the back of the throat. A spoonful of that preserve spread across cold cornbread turned a plain morning meal into something worth remembering. Some cooks left the skins in for texture. Others strained them out and kept only the dark, syrupy pulp. Wild muscadines still grow across the South today, but walking into the woods with a bucket, picking them off the vine by hand, and cooking them down over an open fire is a practice that belonged to a time when free fruit on a tree was not something any working man would walk past. Number 8, hard camp biscuits. These were not the soft, flaky biscuits that Southern cooking became famous for. The cook mixed flour, water, a bit of lard, and enough salt to give them some life, then worked the dough until it was tight and rolled it flat. They baked dense, dry, and solid enough to survive a full day inside a coat pocket or a canvas sack without crumbling. A worker carried a few into the field at dawn and ate them cold at midday, sometimes cracking one into broth or hot coffee to soften it back into something his jaw could handle. They were closer to military hardtack than to anything a grandmother would recognize as a biscuit. The whole point was durability. A cook who turned out biscuits light enough to enjoy had also turned out biscuits that would be crumbs by noon. The hard camp biscuit solved one specific problem: how to put calories into a man who would not come within sight of the cook shack again until sundown. Once tin lunch pails and portable containers became common along the levee, there was no longer any reason to bake bread that doubled as a building material. Number 7 is where opinions split. Chitlins, the cleaned intestines of a hog boiled for hours until they turned soft, tender, and nearly translucent. In a levee camp, chitlins were the most labor-intensive food a cook could prepare and the most divisive. The smell during the long boil carried far enough to clear a wide radius around the cook shack. Some workers lined up for them. Others could not get past the smell or the knowledge of what they were eating. But a camp cook who took on chitlins had access to pounds of protein that the contractor considered waste because hog intestines were the cut no white kitchen in the Delta wanted to touch. Cleaning was the real work. Each piece had to be turned inside out, scraped, soaked in salt water, rinsed again and again, and inspected by hand before it went near the pot. A careless job meant grit in every bite. A thorough one took the better part of a day. The cook who volunteered for chitlin duty was making a statement about what the camp deserved. It would have been simpler to throw the intestines away and serve another round of cornmeal mush. Instead, someone chose to spend hours turning offal into something men asked for by name. That choice, labor piled on top of labor to make something worth eating out of what someone else had thrown away, is the part that gets lost when people reduce chitlins to poverty food. The dish is still prepared in Black households today, especially around the holidays, but the levee camp version, cleaned and boiled in a single sitting by one cook for hundreds of workers, belongs to a scale of feeding that no longer exists. Number 6, sweet potato pone. The cook grated raw sweet potatoes by hand against a piece of punctured tin until the bowl was full of wet orange pulp. Into that went sorghum, a little ginger if the camp had any, and enough lard to keep it from sticking. The mixture was poured into a greased pan and baked low and slow near the edge of the fire until the top turned dark and cracked and the inside set into a dense, sticky mass that was somewhere between a pudding and a cake. Sweet potato pone was heavy, dark, and deeply sweet in a way that refined sugar never quite matched. Cutting it required a strong knife because the texture was almost rubbery from the natural starch. Workers ate it in thick slabs, usually cold the next morning, and it held together well enough to carry into the field. The dish goes back to the earliest days of the plantation South, when sweet potatoes were one of the few crops that enslaved people were allowed to grow for themselves. On the levee, it served the same purpose it always had, turning the cheapest vegetable available into something that felt like a reward at the end of a brutal day. Number 5, sorghum candy. When a levee camp had sorghum syrup, which was most of the time in the Delta, the cook could boil it down further until it thickened, pass syrup into a dark, chewy taffy. Poured onto a greased tin and pulled while it cooled, it hardened into a candy that tasted like molasses with a deeper, grassier bite underneath. No sugar, no butter, no vanilla. The entire flavor came from the sorghum itself, concentrated by heat. Workers carried pieces in their pockets and chewed on them during the afternoon stretch. It was the only candy most levee camp children ever tasted, because the camps sometimes housed entire families, not just working men. Sorghum candy took time and a cook who could judge the temperature by sight alone. When cheap store-bought candy showed up in the rural South, the homemade version stopped being worth the effort. Number 4, boiled field peas. Not the smooth green peas from a can. Field peas were rough, small, and dried on the vine before harvest. They came in dozens of varieties across the Delta. Crowder peas, lady peas, sea island reds. The cook used whatever the supply wagon carried or whatever grew in a patch behind the shack. Soaked overnight if there was time, then boiled with salt pork until they softened and the cooking liquid thickened into a cloudy, savory broth. A bowl of field peas with a piece of cornbread beside it was a complete meal by levee camp standards. The peas delivered protein the rest of the diet lacked. They stored dry without refrigeration and cooked without attention once the pot was on the fire. When canned beans became affordable across the South, the long soak and slow cook of dried field peas lost its place in daily meals. Number 3, roasted green corn in the husk. When corn was in season and the contractor provided it, or when a nearby field offered what a worker could carry, the cook buried unhusked ears directly in the hot coals of the fire. The husk charred black on the outside and steamed the corn inside its own moisture. Pulling back the blackened layers revealed kernels that were smoky, sweet, and tender in a way that boiled the corn never matched. A man ate it straight off the cob, standing by the fire with no plate and no utensil. It was one of the few foods in a levee camp that tasted good enough to eat for pleasure rather than necessity. When the camps closed and cooking moved indoors, corn moved to the boiling pot. The roasted in the husk version became a campfire novelty instead of a daily food. Number 2, river clam broth. Freshwater mussels lived in the shallows and sandbars of every river and bayou where levee crews worked. A man wading in after a shift could gather a bucket of them in minutes. The cook dropped the whole shells into boiling water until they opened, pulled the meat out, and used the cloudy, mineral-rich broth as the base for whatever else went into the pot that night. The clam meat itself was tough and chewy, not something most men looked forward to eating on its own. But the broth carried a depth of flavor that plain water never could, and it stretched a thin soup into something that tasted like a meal. The mussels cost nothing. They required no bait, no hook, no gun, just hands and a bucket. As the rivers silted up from levee construction and upstream farming, the mussel beds thinned out. The men who once gathered them by the bucketful watched the sandbars go bare. The broth that had anchored 100 camp suppers simply stopped being possible to make. Number 1, water gravy, flour, water, and the drippings left in the pan after frying whatever meat the camp had that day. The cook scraped the browned bits from the bottom of the skillet, stirred in a handful of flour until it darkened, then added water slowly until it thickened into a pale, thin gravy. It went over biscuits, over cornbread, over rice, over anything that needed moisture and something that resembled flavor. Water gravy was the last stop before nothing. When the salt pork was gone and the cornmeal was running low and the river had not given up a catfish in days, a cook with a dirty skillet and a cup of flour could still put something on the table that tasted like someone cared. The name says everything. Gravy made from water. The levee held back the river. The food held together the men, and water gravy was the final line in both directions.
Pralines were the Christmas candy that connected African American families to New Orleans traditions, a creamy pecan confection that spread through Black communities across the South. Made from brown sugar, butter, cream, and whole pecans, pralines required careful attention to temperature and timing to achieve their signature texture: creamy yet firm, sweet yet deeply caramelized. Black families made pralines in large batches during weeks before Christmas, storing them in tins for gift-giving and visitors. The process was social, with women gathering in kitchens to stir, test, and drop the candy onto buttered marble or wax paper. Children learned to judge readiness by the way the mixture fell from a spoon, forming soft mounds that set into perfect circles. Each family had their own ratio of pecans to sugar, some preferring more nuts, others favoring creamier candy. Pralines were given to teachers, mail carriers, and church members as tokens. This candy carried culture and community in every bite.
Number 20, pan-fried pork chops. The pork chop was the backbone of a Saturday night juke joint plate, not a thick-cut chop from a butcher counter. A thin, bone-in chop, pounded flat with the side of a cleaver, seasoned with salt, black pepper, and garlic powder, dredged through flour, and fried in a cast-iron skillet with enough lard to come halfway up the side, the edges crisped until they curled. The bone stuck out past the plate. 2 chops, a scoop of rice, and a ladle of gravy made a plate that held a man through a night of dancing and drinking. Nobody sat down to eat in most joints. You stood at the counter, ate fast, and went back to the floor. The chops were cooked in batches, and when they were gone, they were gone. No second round. Here's something worth saying out loud. The Mississippi juke joint was never a business in the way most people understand that word. There was no lease, no health inspection, no liquor license. A woman with a shotgun house and a strong arm opened her front room on a Friday night, moved the furniture against the wall, and started cooking. The music came because the food came first. Robert Johnson did not play juke joints because they had stages. He played them because someone was frying fish in the back and people gathered where the food was. The building was secondary. The cook was primary. Every dish on this list exists because a woman decided her kitchen was big enough to feed a crowd, and nobody from any government office ever told her she could or could not do it. That was the economy of the Delta, invisible, untaxed, and alive every Saturday night. Number 23, potlikker poured over cornbread. Potlikker was the broth left behind after greens cooked down for 2 hours with a piece of fatback. Most white kitchens of the era poured it down the drain. In a sharecropper kitchen, it was the meal. A wedge of crumbled cornbread went into a tin cup. The dark green liquid, thick with iron and pork fat, was ladled over the top. You ate it with a spoon, sopping every drop. The greens themselves came second. The liquor came first. WPA interviewers in 1938 noted that black children in the Delta often had stronger blood iron levels than their white neighbors. The home economists at the USDA traced it back to this single habit. Nothing was wasted. The juice was more nourishing than the leaf. If you grew up with a kitchen that poured its potlikker over your cornbread, you know exactly what dignity tasted like. That mattered more than any cookbook ever explained.
Fresh coconut cake was the crown jewel of African American Christmas tables, a labor of love that began with cracking open whole coconuts by hand. This wasn't the shredded coconut from bags. This was fresh white meat, grated into fluffy piles that smelled like tropical paradise in December. Black families would purchase coconuts weeks ahead, checking them for freshness by shaking to hear the water inside. The cake itself was a towering white layer cake, but the magic happened in the frosting. a 7-minute icing that required constant beating over boiling water until it formed glossy peaks. Fresh coconut was folded into the frosting and pressed onto every surface until the cake looked caught in a snowstorm. Children would fight over who got to drink the coconut water and eat the leftover shreds. This cake demanded hours of work, but delivered pure Christmas magic. Fresh coconut cake proved that the best celebrations came from effort, not shortcuts.
Number 24, mustard greens with smoked ham. Collards got the fame, but mustard greens were the cook's preference in the hill country joints east of the Delta. The leaves were sharper, almost peppery, and they cooked down faster, which mattered when you were feeding people between sets. A ham bone went into the pot before noon. By the time the first guitar player showed up, the greens had gone soft and the potlikker was dark enough to drink from a cup. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar at the end. Others dropped in a dried chili pepper for heat. The greens came on a plate next to cornbread, and nobody asked for a fork. You folded the cornbread, scooped, and ate. Number 23, pinto beans. In a Delta Juke joint, pinto beans were Monday food and Saturday food, and every day in between. A 2-pound bag cost pennies. The cook soaked them overnight, added whatever smoked meat was left from the week, salt, black pepper, and onion cut in half, and let the pot work for hours. There was no recipe. The beans were done when the cook said they were done. Served over rice with a square of cornbread on the side, a plate could feed a man through a night of dancing. Most joints charged 50 cents, sometimes a quarter if you were a regular. The taste changed every time because the meat was never the same twice. Number 24, salt pork and field peas. The Brer Rabbit molasses tin sat on the same shelf as the salt pork bucket in most sharecropper kitchens of the 1930s. Field peas, sometimes called crowders or whippoorwills, were a tradition passed down from the old days, grown on the edge of the cotton patch where the landowner did not bother to count rows. A woman would simmer a handful of dried peas with a chunk of salt pork all afternoon while the fire burned low. The pork rendered into the broth. The peas softened into a thick, smoky stew. By dusk, the whole cabin smelled like Sunday dinner, even if it was a Tuesday in August. Field peas fed sharecropper families through the lean weeks between cotton chopping in June and cotton picking in September. They were planted in the spaces between the cash crop. They were grown on land nobody else wanted, and they kept your great-grandparents alive when the furnish account had nothing left to give. They were following a memory.
Divinity candy was the temperamental diva of African-American Christmas confections, a fluffy white candy that would only cooperate on dry winter days. Made from sugar, corn syrup, and egg whites beaten until impossibly light, Divinity required perfect conditions to achieve its cloud-like texture. Black families learned to check the weather before attempting a batch. Too much humidity and the candy would never set, remaining a sticky mess. When it worked, Divinity was pure magic, melting on the tongue with intense sweetness and a slight chew. Pecans or walnuts were often folded in for crunch, turning simple candy into something worth saving for company. Women would drop spoonfuls onto wax paper, working quickly before the mixture stiffened. Divinity was passed around in tins at church gatherings and packed into Christmas gift boxes for neighbors. This candy was Christmas alchemy, transforming sugar and air into something that seemed to defy kitchen science entirely.
Number 17, sweet potato, cobbler. Not sweet potato pie, cobbler. The difference mattered. A pie required a proper crust rolled out on a clean surface with a rolling pin and patience. A cobbler just needed batter poured over the top and shoved into the oven. In a juke joint kitchen that was already frying pork chops and boiling greens, cobbler was the dessert that took care of itself. The sweet potatoes were peeled, sliced, layered in a pan with brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a few pats of butter. The batter went over the top thick and simple, just flour, sugar, milk, and a little vanilla. It baked until the edges bubbled up golden, and the center stayed soft enough to need a spoon. A slice cost $0.25. Nobody turned it down. Number 16, neck bones and spaghetti. This combination confused people who did not grow up with it. Pork neck bones, browned in a skillet, and then braised in tomato sauce for 3 or 4 hours until the meat pulled away from the bone with no effort. The spaghetti cooked separately and went on the plate underneath. The sauce from the neck bones served as the topping. There was no parmesan, no basil, no garlic bread on the side. This was not Italian food. This was Delta food that borrowed the noodle and made it something else entirely. The dish showed up in Juke joints because it stretched. A few pounds of neck bones, the cheapest cut at any market, could sauce enough spaghetti to feed 30 people. The bones themselves were the prize. You gnawed them clean and stacked them on the side of the plate like a small wall. Number 22, molasses poured over a hot biscuit. This was the dish Fannie Lou Hamer remembered from her childhood on the W.D. Marlowe farm in Sunflower County, Mississippi, where she was born in 1917. Her mother would bake biscuits before dawn using flour bought on credit from the furnish store. A jar of dark sorghum or Brer rabbit molasses sat in the middle of the table. Each child got one biscuit, split open, with a slow stream of molasses poured into the center. The molasses softened the crumb. The biscuit caught the syrup. That was supper for a child too young to chop cotton. Hamer was the youngest of 20 siblings. Her family worked land they did not own and ate food the landowner counted against their share. Back then, by the time you turned 6, you were picking cotton beside your mother. The biscuit and molasses was the meal she remembered for the rest of her life, all the way to her death in 1977.
Plain cake was the undisputed queen of African-American Christmas celebrations, a towering confection that took days to prepare and demanded skills passed down through generations. Originating in Alabama during the late 1800s, this 4-layer white cake was filled with a bourbon-soaked mixture of raisins, pecans, and coconut that seemed almost sinful in its richness. Black families adopted and elevated this recipe, often adding extra whiskey or homemade vanilla. The preparation began days before Christmas, with the filling needing time to cure and the flavors melding into something magnificent. Women would crack pecans by hand, soak raisins in bourbon, and carefully separate dozens of eggs to achieve the perfect tender crumb. The white icing, applied in thick swirls, made the cake look like a snow-covered mountain. Children knew not to touch it until Christmas dinner was served. Plain cake represented more than dessert. It was proof that Black women could create elegance from simple ingredients.
Number 19, cornbread dressing. This was not Thanksgiving food in a juke joint. This was year-round food made from leftover cornbread that had gone too dry to eat on its own. The cook crumbled it by hand into a deep pan, mixed in chopped onion, celery if she had it, sage from the yard, salt, pepper, and enough chicken broth to make the whole thing hold together when you pressed it with a spoon. It baked in the oven until the top crusted over and the inside stayed soft and almost wet in the center. Cornbread dressing in the Delta was never stuffed inside a bird. It was baked in its own pan, cut into squares, and served alongside whatever meat was on the plate that night. The juke joint version was denser than the holiday kind. It had to be. A loose, fluffy dressing would fall apart on a paper plate held in one hand while the other held a jar of whiskey. The dressing had to be firm enough to eat, standing up, without a table, without a proper fork. Some cooks added ground pork sausage to the mix, the kind that came loose in a paper wrapper from the man who butchered hogs on the edge of town. Others put in a handful of pecans cracked from the tree in the side yard. One cook in Bentonia was known for pressing a chopped hard-boiled egg into the center of each serving, so when you broke it open, you found something you did not expect. That was not a garnish. That was a message. It meant the cook was thinking about each plate individually, not just feeding a crowd. The dressing soaked up the drippings from whatever sat next to it, which meant it tasted different every night. Next to pork chops, it tasted like pork. Next to fried fish, it picked up the cornmeal and salt. Nobody wrote that recipe down. It existed in the hands of the woman who made it, and it died when she stopped cooking. Number 25, hot water cornmeal cakes. A cup of cornmeal, a pinch of salt. Boiling water poured in until the meal turned into a thick paste. That was the whole recipe. A sharecropper's wife would scoop the paste into her palm, flatten it, and drop it into a cast iron skillet slick with bacon grease. The cakes hissed and crusted in under 3 minutes. Children ate them, standing up before walking the cotton row at sunrise. Hot water cornbread was the breakfast that did not need eggs, did not need milk, did not need anything the landowner controlled at the furnish store. You could make it with what you already had. A grandmother in Tallahatchie County made these every single morning of her working life from 1928 to 1962. Not because they were beautiful, because they were always possible. Back then, they were the meal you could rely on when the cupboard had given up everything else. Your grandmother called it breakfast.
Japanese fruitcake had nothing to do with Japan, but everything to do with African American Christmas traditions across the Deep South. This layered spice cake earned its exotic name from the unusual combination of ingredients: coconut, raisins, and warm spices stacked between alternating layers of light and dark cake. Black families made this for Christmas because it showcased skill and patience, with each layer requiring separate preparation. The white layers were tender and light, while the dark layers were dense with spices, nuts, and dried fruit. A thick coconut frosting bound everything together, often made with freshly grated coconut that families cracked by hand. The cake improved over several days, making it perfect for Christmas Eve preparation. Grandmothers guarded their recipes closely, adjusting spice ratios to family preferences. Japanese fruitcake was celebration made edible, a towering statement that Christmas in Black households meant going all out for those you loved most.
Number 25, fried buffalo fish. In the Delta, the buffalo was never the animal on the plains. It was a thick, bony fish pulled from the Yazoo River and the Oxbow Lakes that dotted the floodplain from Greenville to Vicksburg. Juke joint cooks scored the flesh in tight crosshatch patterns, salted it heavy, rolled it in cornmeal, and dropped it into lard so hot it barely sputtered. The scoring was the secret. It turned the tiny pin bones into something crisp enough to chew through. Nobody filleted a buffalo fish. That would have been an insult to the woman who taught you how to eat one. You picked it up with your hands, pulled the meat from the spine, and left the bones on a piece of newspaper. A plate cost less than $1 well into the 1980s. Today, most people under 50 have never heard of it.
Boiled custard was Christmas in a cup, a silky, drinkable dessert that African American families stirred slowly over low heat until it coated the back of a spoon. Unlike store-bought eggnog, this was made from scratch with eggs, sugar, milk, and vanilla, cooked with patience that couldn't be rushed. The process required constant stirring to prevent curdling, a skill grandmothers passed to daughters while sharing stories. Served chilled in small glasses, boiled custard was rich enough to feel like dessert, but light enough to sip throughout Christmas Day. Some families added a splash of bourbon for the adults, creating a version that warmed from the inside out. Children would beg for just one more glass, their upper lips painted white with creamy sweetness. The custard was often made Christmas Eve, chilling overnight so the flavors could deepen. Boiled custard represented patience and tradition, proof that the best Christmas treats couldn't be rushed or purchased.
Every pot, every fire, every plate on this list was kept going by someone who never received credit for keeping a workforce alive. A camp cook on the Mississippi Levee line fed hundreds of men a day with ingredients that a modern kitchen would throw away without thinking. Try roasting an ear of corn in its husk over hot coals this week. Drop the one food your family held onto in the comments. The men built the levee built the modern Delta, and the cooks who kept those men standing did it with cornmeal, salt pork, river water, and a refusal to let anyone go hungry on their watch.